The crude wooden sign pinned to her worn calico dress read "Too old at 18" in bold black letters. And Garrick Ironmore felt something crack wide open in his chest the moment he saw it. The Sweetwater County fair buzzed with the usual chaos of late summer fiddle music drifting from the dance platform, children shrieking with delight at the puppet show, and the sweet sharp smell of apple cider mingling with dust and horse sweat. But Garrick's world narrowed to the girl standing alone beside the marriage booth. Her chin held high despite the cruel advertisement someone had forced upon her. She was beautiful in the way. Prairie wildflowers were beautiful, not showy. Like the roses the town ladies cultivated, but with a quiet strength that caught your breath. Auburn hair escaped her simple braid, catching fire in the afternoon sun, and her green eyes held a defiance that spoke of winters survived in dignity, earned through hardship. $5 for a bride, called out Ezra Pemberton, the marriage broker, his voice cutting through the crowd like a rusty blade. Fresh stock from the orphan train. This one's got all her teeth and knows her letters. Garrick's hands clenched into fists.
Oh.
The girl, for she was barely more than that, stood perfectly still as curious townspeople circled her like vultures, eyeing carrion. Her shoulders never sagged, not even when Mrs. Abernathy clicked her tongue disapprovingly and declared her past her prime for proper breeding. The injustice of it burned in Garrick's throat like bad whiskey. At 28, he'd built his ranch from nothing but stubbornness and sweat, carved a life from the unforgiving Colorado territory that stretched endless and beautiful toward the mountains. He'd always figured he'd marry someday when the right woman came along, when the timing felt natural. But watching this girl endure the humiliation with such quiet grace, he knew his carefully laid plans meant nothing. "I'll take her," he said, his voice carrying across the sudden hush that had fallen over the crowd. Pemberton's eyes lit up with dollar signs. "This one's been traveling for weeks, all the way from—" I said, "I'll take her." Garrick stepped forward, pulling a roll of bills from his vest pocket. "Name your price." The girl's eyes met his then, and he saw surprise flicker across her features. Not gratitude. Exactly, but something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. As if she'd been waiting for someone to see her as more than damaged goods, or a burden to be disposed of. "Well now," Pemberton rubbed his hands together greedily. "Seeing as how she's got some education and she's healthy as a horse, I'd say $15 would be fair." "Done." Garrick counted out the bills without taking his eyes off the girl. "But first, we're removing that damned sign." He reached for the wooden placard, his fingers working at the safety pin that secured it to her dress. His knuckles brushed against her collarbone as he worked, and he felt her intake of breath, soft. As a whisper, the sign came free with a small tearing sound, and Garrick crushed it in his fist before dropping it into the dust. "What's your name?" he asked quietly, aware that half the town was watching this peculiar courtship unfold. "Thalia Ravenshade," she replied, her voice clear and steady despite the circumstances. "And I want you to know I won't be any man's burden. I can work, I can earn my keep." Something in her tone told him there was steel beneath that quiet exterior, forged in fires he could only imagine. "Miss Ravenshade," he said formally, "I'm Garrick Ironmore. I've got a spread about 10 miles north of here, and I could use a partner more than I need a servant." "A partner?" The word seemed to surprise her. "Someone who can think for herself, someone who won't wilt at the first sign of trouble." He paused, studying her face. "I'm guessing you've seen your share of trouble already." For the first time since he'd approached, her composed mask slipped slightly. Pain flickered in her green eyes, old pain, the kind that settles deep in your bones and changes how you see the world. But it was gone almost immediately, replaced by that steady determination. "I have," she said simply, "more than most. If you're done with the pleasantries, we've got papers to sign. Marriage license costs extra, another $5. Garrick handed over the additional money without hesitation, but his attention remained fixed on Thalia. "Are you willing?" he asked. "Because if you're not, I'll pay Pemberton to tear up those papers right now. I'll put you on the next train. East with enough money to start fresh wherever you choose." The offer hung between them like a bridge she could either cross or burn. Around them, the fair continued its cheerful chaos, but in their small circle of space, time seemed suspended. Garrick found himself holding his breath, waiting for her answer. Though he couldn't say why her decision mattered so much to a man who'd been content with solitude for years, Dalia studied his face for a long moment, as if reading something written there in lines of sun and weather and honest work. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a life-changing choice. "I've been unwanted since the day I was born," she said. "Cast off by people who should have protected me, shuffled from place to place like an old coat nobody wants to mend, but you. ... She paused, something vulnerable flickering in her expression. "You looked at me like I was worth saving." "You are," Garrick said without hesitation. "Worth saving? Worth knowing." Worth, but his words were cut short by the sharp crack of gunfire echoing across the fairgrounds, followed immediately by screams and the thunder of panicked horses. The gunshots came from the direction of the bank. 3 sharp cracks that sent the crowd scattering like startled sparrows. Garrick's hand instinctively moved to the Colt .45 at his hip as he stepped protectively in front of Thalia, his eyes scanning the chaos for threats. "Bank robbery," someone shouted, and the words rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Women gathered their children close, while men reached for weapons, the festive atmosphere evaporating faster than morning dew. "Stay close," Garrick murmured to Thalia, but when he glanced back, he was surprised to see her standing calm as still water, her green eyes alert but unafraid. Most women would be in hysterics by now, but she watched the unfolding drama with the steady gaze of someone who'd learned early that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Pemberton had disappeared at the first sign of trouble, leaving his papers scattered in the dust. Through the gaps between fleeing fairgoers, Garrick caught sight of 3 riders thundering away from the Sweetwater bank, flour sacks bulging from their saddlebags. The leader wore a black duster that billowed behind him like wings, and even from this distance, Garrick could see the cruel set of his shoulders. "Draven Ashwind," he breathed, recognizing the outlaw's distinctive silhouette. The name tasted bitter on his tongue. Schwinn's gang had been terrorizing settlements across the territory for months, leaving a trail of burned homesteads and grieving widows in their wake. Sheriff Cornelius Bramble came huffing up to the dispersing crowd, his star glinting dully on his vest. "Anyone see which way they headed?" "North toward Devil's Canyon," called out Mayor Hendricks, mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "Lord help us, they took nearly everything in the vault." Garrick's blood ran cold. North meant they'd be riding straight through his land, past his cabin, his livestock, everything he'd built with his own 2 hands. Worse yet, if Ashwin's gang decided to hole up in the canyon's caves, they could terrorize the whole valley for weeks. "I need to get home," he said, more to himself than anyone else. His prize bull, Goliath, was worth more than most men saw in a year, and his mare, Whisper, was heavy with foal. If the outlaws decided his spread looked ripe for pillaging, "Mr. Ironmore," Thalia's voice cut through his worried calculations, "what about our arrangement?" He turned to face her, seeing his own urgency reflected in her intelligent eyes. Marriage papers lay scattered at their feet, unsigned and already forgotten by the fleeing crowd. Any reasonable woman would take this chaos as a sign from Providenza, chance to escape a hasty decision made in the heat of the moment. But Talia Ravenshade was beginning to realize was far from reasonable. "I meant what I said about giving you a choice," Garrick told her quietly. "This changes things. My ranch might not be safe, and I can't promise I've never been safe anywhere." She interrupted, her chin lifting with that familiar defiance. "At least with you, I'd be choosing my own risks." Something shifted in his chest at her words, a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Without another word, he gathered the scattered papers and smoothed them against his thigh. "Then we'd better make this official before we ride out." Sheriff Bramble was too distracted, organizing a posse to perform any ceremonies. But old Father Mackenzie had been manning the church booth nearby. The Irish priest's eyes twinkled with curiosity as Garrick approached, Thalia at his side. "Father, we need a wedding, fast." "Ah, young love," Mackenzie chuckled, then sobered as he took in their urgent expressions. "Oh, I suppose with outlaws on the loose, fast might be wise indeed." The ceremony was brief note music, save the distant shouts of the posse forming up. No flowers except the prairie roses Thalia plucked from a nearby bush and tucked into her braid. But when Garrick spoke his vows, looking into her green eyes as he promised to protect and cherish her, the words felt as binding as iron chains and twice as precious. "By the power vested in me," Father Mackenzie intoned, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. May God bless this union and keep you both in his care." The kiss was meant to be ceremonial, a brief touch of lips to seal their bargain. But the moment Garrick's mouth met Thalia's, something electric passed between them. Her hand came up to rest against his chest, over his heart, and he felt the gesture like a brand. When they broke apart, her cheeks were flushed pink as sunset clouds. "Mrs. Ironmore," he said softly, testing the name. "Mrs. Ironmore," she repeated, and for the first time since he'd met her. She smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face and made his breath catch. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the spell. Garrick's neighbor, Willem Sturgis, came galloping up on his bay gelding, his weathered face grim with news. "Garrick, thank God I found you." Ashwin's boys hit the Weatherby place on their way north, burned the barn, scattered the cattle. Mrs. Weatherby said they were asking questions about, "You wanted to know where your spread was located?" Ice formed in Garrick's veins. The Weatherby ranch was only 5 miles from his own land. Did they hurt anyone? No, but they made it clear they'd be back. Mrs. Weatherby heard one of them say something about teaching the big rancher a lesson. Willem's eyes flicked to Thalia, taking in her travel-worn dress and the wilted roses in her hair. "I don't mean to pry, but is this really the time for?" "This is my wife," Garrick said firmly, his arm moving protectively around Talia's waist. "Talia, this is Willem Sturgis, my nearest neighbor." Willem's eyebrows shot up, but he was too much of a gentleman to comment on the hasty timing. Instead, he touched his hat brim respectfully. "Ma'am. Pleasure to meet you, though I wish the circumstances were better," Mr. Sturgis, Thalia replied with quiet dignity. "I understand there may be danger. What can we do to help?" Willem looked surprised by her direct question, but Garrick felt a surge of pride. His new wife wasn't the type to swoon at the first sign of trouble. She wanted to face it head on. "The sheriff's forming a posse," Willem explained, "but it'll take ours to get organized." Meanwhile, Ashwin could be fortifying himself in Devil's Canyon, or worse, using your place as a base while he plans his next raid. Garrick's jaw tightened. Everything he'd worked for hung in the balance, but now he had more than just property to protect. Thalia had placed her trust in him, her future in his hands. The thought of her facing down desperate outlaws made his blood run cold. "We're riding home," he decided. "I won't let them destroy what I've built." "Garrick," Willem said carefully, "maybe you should consider taking your wife somewhere safe first. My place? Or back to town?" "No." Thalia's voice was steady as granite. "I go where my husband goes." The two men stared at her in surprise, but Thalia's expression didn't waver. Garrick studied her face, seeing the steel beneath her quiet exterior. She'd survived orphan trains and marriage brokers, endured humiliation. With grace and dignity intact, perhaps she was stronger than either of them gave her credit for. "Can you ride?" he asked. "I can learn quickly." Willem shook his head in bewilderment. "You two are either very brave or very foolish." "Maybe both," Garrick admitted, his hand finding Thalia's and squeezing gently. "But we're facing it together." As they prepared to leave the fairgrounds, Thalia paused to look back at the trampled grass where the marriage booth had stood. The wooden sign that had proclaimed her too old at 18 lay forgotten in the dust, crushed beneath the feet of fleeing townspeople. "No regrets?" Garrick asked, following her gaze. She turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw not fear, but determination, burning bright as forge fire. "Only one," she said quietly. "I wish we'd had more time before." Her words trailed off as a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the prairie, though the sky above remained cloudless blue. It took Garrick a moment to realize it wasn't thunder at all, but the sound of many horses moving fast across hard ground, and they were heading straight for his ranch. The ride to Garrick's ranch stretched across rolling hills that undulated like a green ocean frozen in time. Talia sat behind him on his massive stallion, Ranger, her arms wrapped around his waist as they galloped toward an uncertain fate. The borrowed horse from Willem followed behind, carrying supplies hastily gathered from the fair ammunition medical kit, and enough food for several days if they found themselves under siege. The rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats couldn't quite drown out Thalia's racing thoughts. 12 hours ago, she'd been just another unwanted orphan facing an uncertain future. Now she wore a thin gold band on her finger, Garrick's mother's ring. He told her quietly as he slipped it onto her hand and rode toward what might be her first and last home as a married woman. "Tell me about the ranch," she called over the wind, wanting to know what they were risking their lives to protect. 300 acres of the prettiest land God ever made, Garrick replied, his voice carrying back to her. Creek runs right through the middle, sweet water that never runs dry. Built the cabin myself from pine I cut in the high country. It's not much, 2 rooms and a loft, but it's solid. Thalia could hear the pride in his voice. It's the deep satisfaction of a man who'd created something lasting with his own hands. She understood that feeling. Though her own creations had been smaller, garden coaxed a bloom behind the orphanage kitchen. Letters taught to younger children by candlelight, small acts of beauty carved from hardship, and the animals. Dozen. Head of cattle, including Goliath finest bull in 3 counties. Whispers my breeding mare due to foal any day now. Chickens, 2 milk cows, and a ornery old rooster named Napoleon who thinks he owns the place. Despite everything, Talia smiled. She could picture at the peaceful ranch where honest work was rewarded with simple pleasures. A place where a woman might plant roses and watch them bloom year after year, where children could run barefoot through tall grass without fear. The dream was interrupted as they crested a ridge and Garrick suddenly reined in his horse. Below them, smoke rose in thin gray ribbons from the direction of his property. Not the white smoke of a cooking fire, but the ominous black smoke that spoke of destruction. "Too late," he said, his voice rough with emotion. But Thalia squinted into the distance, studying the smoke patterns with eyes trained by years of watching for signs of trouble. "No," she said slowly. "Look at how it's rising straight up. No. Wind to scatter it. That's not a building fire. More like a signal fire, or maybe a forge." Garrick twisted in the saddle to look at her with surprise. "How do you know that? The orphanage was near the rail yards. I learned to read smoke like other girls read novels." She pointed toward the valley. "See how it's coming from the north pasture, not the cabin? If they'd burned your house, the smoke would be thicker, more scattered." Hope flickered in his dark eyes. "You might be right. That means they're still there, making themselves comfortable on my land." They dismounted at the tree line, leaving, the horses hidden in a grove of aspens whose leaves whispered secrets in the afternoon breeze. Willem had given them his field glasses, and Garrick trained them on the valley below, while Thalia kept watch. 4 of them, he reported grimly. Ashwind and 3 others. "I've got my cattle penned up near the creek, and they're using my hay for their fire. Bastards are treating the place like their own personal camp." Thalia took the glasses and studied the scene below. The outlaws had indeed made themselves at home. Their horses grazed freely in Garrick's pasture while the men lounged around a crackling fire built from fence posts they'd torn down. She could see Goliath pacing restlessly in an improvised pen, the magnificent bull's distress evident even from this distance. "Where's your mare?" she asked. Garrick's jaw tightened. "In the barn, I hope, if they've hurt," whispered ... "They haven't." Talia handed back the glasses. "Look at their body language. They're relaxed, confident. Men who've just committed cruelty have a different way of moving, tighter, more aggressive. These men are simply waiting. Waiting for what?" That was the question that made Thalia's stomach clench with dread. Outlaws didn't linger unless they had a specific purpose. Ashwin's reputation was built on swift strikes and quicker escapes, not camping on stolen land. "They know you'll come back," she realized. "This isn't just robbery, it's a trap." Garrick's face went pale beneath his tan. "They want me to try to reclaim what's mine, make me desperate enough to do something foolish. But why? What would Draven Ashwind want with one rancher?" The answer came to her even as she asked the question, settling in her mind like a cold stone. She'd heard enough talk at the fair to piece together the local politics, the railroad company, buying up land for a new route, the holdout ranchers, refusing to sell, the mysterious fires and accidents that had befallen those who stood in the way of progress. "You won't sell to the railroad," she said quietly. "Your land is in their path, and you're standing in the way of a very lucrative deal." Garrick's expression confirmed her suspicions. "The Colorado and Southern offered me 3 times what my spread is worth, but I turned them down. This land, ... He gestured toward the valley where his cattle grazed and his dreams had taken root. "This is my legacy, but I'll pass down to my children someday." The word children hung between them, weighted with new meaning. A few hours ago it had been his hypothetical future. Now it was theirs. Assuming they lived long enough to have one, a new sound drifted up from the valley, harsh laughter and the musical clink of bottles. The outlaws were celebrating something, passing around what looked like a jug of whiskey. Their voices carried on the still air, though most of the words were lost to distance. ... Railroad boys ... pay handsomely ... burned out proper ... Thalia's blood turned to ice water. Now, they're not just here to steal your cattle. They're here to make sure you can never rebuild. As if summoned by her words, one of the men below stood and walked toward the cabin with deliberate steps. Even from their hiding place, Thalia could see the confident swagger of a man carrying out a well-rehearsed plan. He disappeared around the back of the house, and a few minutes later, smoke began rising from that direction as well. The barn, Garrick breathed, his knuckles white where they gripped the glasses. "They're burning the barn." The smoke changed color and thickness, becoming the hungry black cloud that spoke of dried hay and seasoned timber feeding eager flames. Through the glasses, Thalia could see the other outlaws laughing and pointing, treating the destruction like entertainment. But then she saw something that made her heart stop. A flash of white moving frantically inside the burning structure. Whisper, trapped in her stall as flames licked at the walls around her. "Garrick," she whispered, but he'd already seen. His face went white as bone, then flushed red with rage. The mare wasn't just valuable livestock. Thalia could see in his expression that she represented something deeper. Hope, perhaps. The future he'd been building one careful step at a time. "I have to get down there," he said, already checking his weapons. "I can't let her burn. It's what they want," Thalia warned, catching his arm. "They're counting on you, doing something heroic and foolish." "Then what would you have me do? Watch everything I've worked for turn to ash?" The anguish in his voice cut through her like a blade. She understood now why he'd torn the sign from her dress, why he'd offered her partnership instead of servitude. Garrick Ironmore was a man who couldn't stand to watch the innocent suffer. Whether it was an unwanted girl at a marriage booth or a pregnant mare trapped in a burning barn, it was going to get him killed. "There might be another way," she said. Slowly, an idea forming in her mind, desperate, but perhaps their only chance. "How well do you know Devil's Canyon?" "I like the back of my hand." "Why?" Thalia studied the outlaws below, noting their positions and the confident way they moved. Men celebrating assumed victory often made careless mistakes, "because I think it's time we taught some lessons of our own." But even as she spoke, the wind shifted, carrying with it the acrid smell of burning wood and something else, the distinctive crack of timber beginning to collapse. The barn was falling, and with it any chance of saving Whisper through conventional means. Time slowed to the rhythm of a dying heartbeat as Garrick watched his barn collapse in on itself, sending sparks spiraling toward the darkening sky like fallen stars. The sound reached them moments later, a thunderous crash that seemed to shake the very earth beneath their feet. "Whisper," he breathed, and Thalia saw something break inside him. But then, through the smoke and chaos, a flash of white burst from the far side of the burning structure. The mare had somehow escaped, galloping free across the pasture with her pale mane streaming like a banner of hope. She was limping slightly, favoring her left foreleg, but she was alive. "She made it," Thalia whispered, relief flooding through her. "She's safe." Garrick's shoulders sagged with momentary relief, but his face remained granite hard. Below them, the outlaws were whooping and firing their guns into the air, celebrating the destruction with savage glee. Draven Ashwin stood silhouetted against the flames, his black duster making him look like death itself come calling. "Act! They'll burn the cabin next," Garrick said, his voice hollow. "Then they'll scatter my cattle and salt the earth so nothing ever grows here again. All to force my hand for the railroad." Thalia studied the scene below, her mind working with the cold precision she'd learned in years of surviving impossible situations. The outlaws had made camp in the center of the valley, confident in their superiority of numbers and firepower. But their very confidence might be their weakness. "How many ways into Devil's Canyon?" she asked. "3 that I know of. Main entrance from the south, a narrow ledge trail from the east, and a crack in the rocks on the north face that barely fits a man sideways. And you know all of them?" "I've hunted every inch of this country since I was 16. His eyes sharpened. As he began to understand her thinking, "What are you planning?" Thalia pointed to where the canyon's dark mouth yawned beyond the ranch. "They're planning to retreat there when they're done here. It's perfect good water, defensible positions. Caves to hide stolen goods. But canyons are also traps, if you know how to spring them. You want to follow them into Devil's Canyon, Thalia? That's madness. 4 armed men against 2, against 1 man and 1 woman they'll never see coming," she corrected. "Think about it, Garrick. What do they see when they look at me? A frightened girl in a torn dress. Someone's discarded property. They won't expect me to be a threat." Garrick studied her face in the gathering dusk, seeing something there that made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about his new wife. "You've done this before?" Turned being underestimated into an advantage. It wasn't a question, and Thalia didn't deny it. Survival teaches you many things, including when to strike and when to wait. Below them, the outlaws were preparing to move. They'd driven Garrick's cattle into a loose herd and were loading their saddlebags with anything of value they could carry. Ashwin gestured toward the cabin, and 2 of his men headed in that direction with obvious intent. "We need to move now," Thalia said urgently, before they finished destroying everything. Garrick was already in motion, checking his rifle and pistol. With practiced efficiency, "What's your plan?" "Get to the canyon ahead of them. Use that north entrance you mentioned. Can you find it in the dark?" "I could find it blind and drunk. Good, while you're setting up in the rocks above their camp. I'll approach from the main entrance. Let them see me. Let them think I'm lost and helpless." "Absolutely not." Garrick's voice was iron. "I won't use my wife as bait." "You're not using me," Thalia said firmly. "I'm choosing this. They took your cattle, burned your barn, destroyed your livelihood. But more than that, they tried to take your hope. Our hope." She moved closer to him, her hand resting over his heart, where she could feel it hammering against his ribs. "I've spent my whole life being a victim of other people's greed and cruelty. Tonight I choose to fight back." Garrick searched her eyes, seeing the steel determination there. This wasn't the frightened girl from the marriage booth. This was a woman who'd found something worth defending and refused to back down. "How do I know you'll be safe?" "Because you'll be watching over me," she said simply, "and because I'm not planning to play the helpless victim for very long." She reached into her traveling bag and pulled out something that made Garrick's eyebrows rise, a small but wickedly sharp knife with an ivory handle clearly designed for more than cutting bread. "Where did you, a girl, learns to protect herself?" "On the orphan trains," Thalia said quietly. "Men think because you're small and female, you're defenseless. It's a mistake I've learned to encourage." The sound of gunfire erupted from the valley below as the outlaws put bullets through the cabin windows, shattering glass and dreams with equal efficiency. Orange light began to flicker behind the broken panes. They'd set the house ablaze as well. "That's everything," Garrick said, his voice thick with grief and rage. 20 years of work, gone in one night." "The buildings can be rebuilt," Thalia said fiercely. "But only if we make sure these men can't do this to anyone else. Only if we stop them here and now." They gathered their weapons and supplies in grim silence, each lost in their own thoughts as they prepared for what might be their last night alive. As they moved through the darkening forest toward Devil's Canyon, Thalia found herself thinking of the crushed wooden sign that had proclaimed her. Too old at 18, Perhaps she had been too old to be innocent, too old to believe in fairy tale rescues, too old to think that someone might want her for herself rather than convenience. But she wasn't too old to fight, and she wasn't too old to choose her own fate. The canyon loomed before them like a great wound in the earth, its walls rising sheer and black against the star-scattered sky. Somewhere in those depths, water trickled over stone with a sound like whispered prayers. It was beautiful in its way, and terrible, the perfect place for desperate men to make their last stand. "The north entrance is about a quarter-mile up," Garrick murmured, his voice barely audible. "Narrow trail, loose rock." "Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure," Thalia replied, though her heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Give me 20 minutes, then work your way down to the rocks above their camp. When you hear me scream, really scream, not just call out. That's your signal." Thalia caught her hand, his fingers warm and calloused against hers. "If something goes wrong, it won't. But if it does, if I can't protect you," she silenced him with a kiss. Fierce and desperate and full of all the words they hadn't had time to say. When they broke apart, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You already saved me," she whispered. "At the fair, when you tore away that sign, you saved me from becoming invisible. From disappearing entirely. Whatever happens tonight, I want you to know that these few hours as your wife have been worth more than all the years before them." Garrick's throat worked as he struggled for words. Finally, he pulled his mother's cameo pin from his vest, Pokita, delicate thing of carved ivory and gold that had somehow survived the rough years since her death. "Oh, for luck," he said gruffly, pinning it to Thalia's dress just above her heart. "My mother always said it would protect the woman I loved." The word hung between them like a bridge love, spoken for the first time but already written in their actions. Their choices, their willingness to face death together rather than live apart. "I love you too," Thalia said simply, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Then she was gone, melting into the shadows like mist, leaving Garrick alone with his weapons and his prayers and the terrible knowledge that everything he'd ever wanted might be snatched away before he'd barely had a chance to hold it below in the canyon. Voices echoed off stone walls as the outlaws made camp, confident in their victory and unaware that retribution was creeping toward them through the darkness. The hunt was about to begin, but as Garrick started his careful climb down the treacherous north face, a new sound reached his ears, the distant rumble of many horses moving fast through the night, heading straight for Devil's Canyon. Reinforcements were coming, and he had no way to warn Thalia that their desperate plan had just become something far more dangerous. The approaching thunder of hoofbeats grew louder as Thalia picked her way down the main canyon trail, her heart hammering against the ivory cameo pinned above it. 20 riders, maybe more, judging by the sound echoing off the stone walls. Either Sheriff Bramble had finally organized his posse, or Ashwind had called in every outlaw from here to Denver. She pressed herself against the canyon wall as the riders thundered past her hiding spot. Her blood turned to ice when she recognized the lead horse, a massive black stallion, ridden by a man in a railroad company jacket. Not reinforcements for justice, but for greed. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The Colorado and Southern wasn't just hiring outlaws to terrorize holdout ranchers. They were coordinating the attacks, timing them perfectly to swoop. And afterward, with generous offers for the newly desperate landowners below in the canyon, she could hear Ashwin's men whooping their greeting to the newcomers. Voices carried clearly in the still air, confirming her worst fears. "Ironmore's place is ashes," Ashwin called out. "Ah, just like you wanted, Morrison." Should make him more reasonable about selling. "Excellent work," came the reply in the cultured tones of a company man. "Though I trust there were no witnesses to our ... arrangement." Thalia's mind raced. Morrison, she'd heard that name at the fair. The railroad's territorial acquisition agent, known for his ruthless efficiency in securing land rights. A man who could afford to hire the territory's most vicious outlaws and still sleep soundly at night. Somewhere above her in the darkness, Garrick was working his way down the north face, unaware that their desperate gamble had just become a suicide mission, 25 armed men against 2. The mathematics of survival had shifted beyond all hope. unless she could change the odds. Moving carefully in the darkness, Thalia crept closer to the outlaw camp. The men had built their fire in a natural amphitheater where the canyon widened, confident that the stone walls would protect them from any threat. But those same walls that made the position defensible also created something else, a perfect echo chamber. She studied the layout with eyes trained by years of noting escape, routes, and defensive positions. The outlaws had positioned themselves carelessly, assuming their numbers made them invulnerable. Their horses were clustered near the narrow stream that ran through the canyon floor. While the men lounged around the fire, passing bottles and counting their stolen money, Morrison stood apart from the outlaws, his expensive clothes and clean-shaven face marking him as clearly as a uniform. Even in the firelight, Thalia could see the cold calculation in his eyes as he surveyed Ashwin's ragged crew. "The Weatherby place is next," Morrison was saying. "Then the Thompson spread. Once we control the entire valley, the railroad can push through without any further delays." "What about the law?" one of the outlaws asked. "That sheriff was forming up a posse when we left town." Morrison laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Sheriff Bramble is 3 hours behind you, following a false trail my men laid toward the Mexican border.
Ow.
By the time he realizes his mistake, this canyon will be empty and Ironmore will be signing papers in my Denver office." Talia's blood boiled at the casual arrogance in his voice. These men destroyed lives the way other people swatted flies without thought, without conscience, without consequence. But tonight, consequences had come calling, moving with the silence she'd learned creeping through orphanage dormitories after curfew. Thalia worked her way around the canyon rim until she found what she was looking for, a massive boulder balanced precariously on a narrow ledge, directly above the horse corral. Years of rain and frost had loosened it from its moorings. It would take only the right pressure in the right place to send it tumbling. She positioned herself carefully, bracing her feet against solid rock while her hands found purchase on the boulder's rough surface. One good push would scatter the horses and create the chaos she needed. But timing was everything. She'd have to wait for the perfect moment. That moment came when Morrison pulled out a leather portfolio and began spreading papers on a flat stone near the fire. Even from her perch high above, Thalia could see the neat rows of signatures on document after document, deeds of sale, transfer papers, mineral rights agreements, the systematic destruction of an entire valley, all laid out in legal black and white. "Ironmore's signature will complete the acquisition," Morrison was saying. "Tomorrow, I'll ride out to make him an offer he can't refuse. A man who's lost everything tends to be quite reasonable about accepting whatever help is offered." The casual cruelty in his words was the last straw. Thalia threw her full weight against the boulder, feeling it shift with a grinding sound of stone against stone. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed too massive to move. Then gravity claimed it. The boulder crashed down the canyon wall like an avalanche, striking other rocks and sending them tumbling in a cascade of destruction that seemed to go on forever. The horses panicked instantly, breaking their rough corral and stampeding in all directions while the men dove for cover. But Thalia wasn't finished. As the echoes of the rock slide faded, she stood up on her precarious perch and let loose the scream she'd promised Garrica. Sound of pure rage and defiance that bounced off the canyon walls and seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You want Ironmore land," she shouted, her voice multiplied by the stone into a chorus of fury. "Come and take it." The outlaws spun in confusion, their weapons drawn but useless against an enemy they couldn't see. In their panic, they fired wildly at shadows, the muzzle flashes revealing their positions to anyone watching from above, and Garrick was watching his. Rifles spoke from the darkness with deadly precision, and one of Morrison's hired guns dropped without a sound. Then another. The surviving outlaws scrambled for cover, but the canyon that had seemed so defensible now felt like a trap. "It's Ironmore." Ashwin snarled. "He's up in the rocks." "Impossible," Morrison snapped. "My sources said he was still in town." "Sources were wrong," came Garrick's voice from the darkness, calm as winter morning. "About a lot of things." Dahlia used the confusion to scramble down from her perch, her small knife ready, in the chaos of scattered horses and panicked men. She was just another shadow among many. She reached the papers Morrison had abandoned and began systematically shredding them, destroying months of carefully orchestrated corruption. "Stop her," Morrison screamed, finally spotting her. "Those documents are worth millions." But stopping her meant exposing themselves to Garrick's rifle, and the outlaws had learned the hard way that he didn't miss. Caught between the sniper above and the fury below, they began to break. "This ain't worth dying for," one of them called out, throwing down his weapon. "I'm done." Others followed his lead, their loyalty to Morrison proving as shallow as his promises. Within minutes, half the gang had surrendered or fled, leaving only Ashwind and his most hardened followers to make their last stand. "You've destroyed everything." Morrison raged at Thalia, his cultured facade cracking to reveal the vicious greed. "Beneath? Do you know what you've cost me?" "I know what you cost my husband," Talia replied coldly, standing amid the scattered remains of his schemes. "His barn, his home, his peace of mind, that those can be rebuilt. Your reputation, on the other hand, ... She gestured to the surrendering outlaws, several of whom were already talking loudly about their deals with the railroad. Company Morrison's face went white as he realized the implications. His carefully hidden corruption was about to become front-page news across the territory. The battle ended not with a climactic gunfight, but with Ashwind himself laying down his weapons as Garrick emerged from the rocks, his rifle trained on. The outlaw's heart. The man who had terrorized the territory for months looked suddenly old and tired in the firelight. "I'm done running," he said simply. "Prison's got to be better than this." As dawn broke over Devil's Canyon, Sheriff Bramble finally arrived with his posse, following the sound of gunfire that had echoed for miles across the valley. He found his prisoners already secured and incriminating documents recovered from the scattered papers Thalia had been unable to destroy. Garrick and Thalia stood together at the canyon's rim, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold and crimson. The cameo pin caught the early light, sparkling like a star above her heart. "Think we can rebuild?" Garrick asked quietly, his arm around her waist. "I know we can," Talia replied, leaning into his warmth. "We've got time. We've got each other, and we've got something those men will never understand." "What's that?" "We know that some things can't be bought or stolen or destroyed. Love, hope, the will to start over, those live in here." She touched the cameo, then his chest over his heart. "And here they're ours forever." As they walked back toward the valley where their life together would begin again, Talia thought about that wooden sign, too old at 18, now trampled to dust beneath the feet of justice. Perhaps she had been too old for some things, but she was exactly the right age for this, for love that faced down impossible odds, for hope that rebuilt from ashes, for a future written in their own hands. If this tale of love conquering all manner of obstacles warmed your heart like a good campfire on a cold night, I'd be much obliged if you'd tip your hat to the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. And do tell us, where in this wide world are you watching? From today,